Every morning before her father came in from the milking, the silent Pryor girl drew her mother's face in the spilled flour on the kitchen table, and every morning, before he could see it, she wiped it away with her sleeve. She was 8 years old, and she had not spoken a word in 3 years, not since the river, and the only place her mother still lived was there in the flour, for a few minutes in the gray Nebraska dawn, before the day swept her under again. No one in that house knew the child did this. No one in that house by then knew much about the child at all. And then, on the first hard frost morning of November, a wagon came up the road carrying the woman who would, if your heart just went still, if you have ever had a grief too large to say out loud, and know what it is to go quiet rather than carry it into the light, then stay with me, because this little girl had been waiting 3 years for the one person who would not ask her to talk. Subscribe to this channel and ring the bell so the next story finds you, and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels tonight, then come back to Cedar Bluff, Nebraska, in the cold autumn of 1885, because the day a silent child finally spoke, every soul in that room would learn the difference between a thing that is broken and a thing that is only waiting. Mabel Ames was 34 years old, and she knew more about silence than anyone in Cedar Bluff would have guessed to look at her. She had been a wife and a mother once, in a sod house in the eastern part of the state, until a hard winter took her husband to the lung fever, and then took her own little girl, 6 years old, to the diphtheria, 11 days behind him. And after that Mabel Ames had not spoken, not for spite and not for show, but because the words simply would not come, because there was nothing left in her the size of speech. For the better part of a year she had gone wordless, and the town had called her touched and given up on her. All but one old woman who came and sat in her kitchen 3 afternoons a week and never once asked her to talk, only sat and shelled peas, and let the silence be a thing they shared instead of a thing that was wrong with Mabel. The words had come back in their own time the way the thaw comes. Mabel had never forgotten what it was to live inside the quiet, or what had finally drawn her out of it, which was not a single soul demanding she speak. It was one soul willing to be silent alongside her. The man who drove her the last miles out told her the rest, the way lonesome men will. "Jesse Pryor," he said. "Good farmer, hard luck. Lost his wife Maggie 3 winters back, and there was a bad story in it. The little girl had gone out on the river ice where she'd been told 100 times not to, and Maggie had run out after her and got the child back to the bank and gone through herself, right in front of the little one, and they never did recover her till spring. Girl ain't said a word since," the driver said, lowering his voice, though there was no one to hear. "Folks call her Simple. The grandmother's been talking about a home for her, one of them places in the city. 3 housekeepers Pryors had since, and none could stand the quiet of that place. You're brave or you're desperate, ma'am. One." He glanced at the size of her and decided wisely to leave it there. Cedar Bluff looked Mabel over when the wagon stopped for the mail, the long, slow measuring she had been weighed by her whole life, and a woman on the walk said something to another, and they laughed the small, cold laugh and added, just loud enough, that the Pryor place deserved whatever it got. Mabel did not give them her face. She had learned that a town will say a cruel thing chiefly to watch it land, and that the surest answer to cruelty is to deny it the satisfaction of a flinch. She looked at the white road ahead instead, and let it all freeze and fall away behind the wheels. The Pryor house, when it rose against the gray, was not a poor house or a dirty one. It was a held-breath house, clean kept and airless, a home where the sound had been turned off 3 years before and never turned back on. A man who could not speak of his grief, and a child who could not speak at all, had been living in the same 4 walls in a silence so total it had its own weather. And in the doorway stood the child, small, watchful, still as a held breath herself, with a smear of flour on one sleeve and eyes that had long ago stopped expecting to be seen. Jesse Pryor came in from the field and looked at Mabel the way a tired man looks at one more thing sure to fail. He was not yet 40 and worn past it. "You'll have heard," he said, and that was nearly all he could manage on the subject. "Wren doesn't talk. The last ones tried to make her, or they talked over her like she wasn't in the room, or they couldn't bear the house. I won't blame you for the wagon back. Keep a clean kitchen and feed us, and let the child be, and the work's yours through the winter." He did not say his daughter's name with any ease. He said it the way a man touches a burn. "I'll keep the kitchen and I'll feed you, and I'll let the child be," Mabel said. Then she looked past him at the little girl in the doorway, and she did not crouch down and put on the bright false voice that strangers use on a child they've decided is broken. She said, plainly, as to anyone, "Hello, Wren, I'm Mabel. I expect we'll get on." And she did not wait for an answer, because she of all people knew that waiting for an answer is its own kind of demand. She carried her trunk inside, and the child watched her go by with the first flicker of something that was not quite hope, because hope was a thing Wren Pryor had given up the same winter she gave up her voice. Mabel did not try to reach the child. That was the whole secret of it, and it was a secret only a woman who had lived in the silence herself could have known. She simply went on as though Wren were an ordinary girl who happened, for reasons of her own, not to be talking just now. She talked to her the same as she'd talk to anyone, narrating the bread, asking her opinion of the soup, and then answering it herself easy and unbothered, leaving room in every sentence for a reply that did not come, and never once acting as though its absence were a failure. She gave the child small real tasks in the kitchen, shelling and stirring and the shaping of rolls, and the two of them worked side by side through those first gray weeks, in a quiet that was, for the first time in 3 years, not a wound but a company, and the house began to smell of things again. Bread, first. Mabel was a baker to her bones, the warm yeasty reek of it filling the held breath rooms and pushing the airlessness back, and then cinnamon and onions and a Sunday chicken. Jessie Pryor came to the table the third night and found a meal on it instead of the joyless fuel 3 years of housekeepers had set down, and he ate it the way a starved man eats, slow and then not slow. And at the end of it he sat a moment longer than he had sat at that table in years, and did not seem to know why. The child ate too, and watched the woman who had made the bread. Jessie Pryor did not know how to thank a person with words. He had mislaid his own words the same. Winter, his daughter, mislaid hers, but he thanked her the way that kind of man does, with his hands and his attention. The kitchen door that had hung crooked since Maggie died swung true one morning, oiled, with nothing said of it. The wood she had been splitting herself stood split and stacked before she reached the block. He took to lingering at the table after Wren was abed, not saying much, only sitting in the lamplight while Mabel worked the next day's dough, and slowly, a sentence one night and two the next, the man began to talk. Small things at the start, the price of seed, the weather coming on, and then one night near the end of the second week, looking at the fire and not at her, he gave up the smallest piece of the thing he never spoke of, that Maggie had baked her bread on Saturdays, and that the smell of bread in the house again was the first thing in 3 years he had not wanted to run clean out the door from. Mabel went on kneading and let him say it, and did not make him say a word more. That was how the two of them began, in the lamplight, over dough, in a house slowly remembering how to make a sound. It was the drawings that told Mabel the truth. She found them by accident, the flower faces, when she came down too early one morning and caught the girl mid-wipe, and after that she watched, and she understood that Wren was not silent for want of things to say. The child was full to bursting with things to say. She said them in flour, and in the dirt of the yard with a stick, and once terribly in a picture Mabel found tucked under the girl's tick, a woman on a sheet of ice, and a small figure on the bank, and beneath it, in the careful, uneven hand of a child who could write what she could not speak, 4 words. I made her go. Mabel sat on the edge of that little bed a long while with the paper in her hand, and felt the bottom drop out of 3 years of mystery. The child had not lost her words to grief. She had locked them up as a punishment. Wren Pryor believed, and had believed every silent day for 3 years, that she had killed her mother, and no living soul had ever told her otherwise, because the one man who could had not been able to say his dead wife's name out loud since the day the river took her. That was the night it caught up with Mabel, and the only night. With the house asleep, she sat at the kitchen table where a dead woman's face got drawn every dawn, and she wept for all of it at once, for her own little girl 11 days behind her husband, for the year she had spent wordless herself, and now for this child up the stairs serving a 3-year sentence for a crime that was never hers. She wept the way she had learned to, into her hands briefly and without sound, taking up no more of the dark than she had to. Then she washed her face and banked the fire, because grief had never yet excused her from the morning, and there was a girl who would want her breakfast and her bread, and, more than either, someone to keep being unafraid of her silence. She did not weep over it again. She had a thing to do now instead. The first word came 8 days later, and it came so quietly, Mabel nearly missed the gift of it. They were shaping rolls together in the late afternoon, and Mabel told her not as a lesson, just as a thing one person tells another about the years she herself had not spoken after her own girl died, and how an old woman had sat with her and shelled peas and waited, and how the words had come back when they were ready and not one moment before, the way the river comes back in spring. "It isn't broken in you, Wren," she said, flouring the board. "It's just resting. It'll come when it trusts the world to hear it." And the child beside her, with her small hands in the dough, said low, rusty, hardly a breath, "Two-word, hurts." The first in 3 years. Mabel did not gasp, did not weep, did not run for the father, did not do a single one of the things that would have sent the words diving back down for another 3 years. She kept shaping her role. "Some," she said, "just as easy. Less after a while. That's the truth, and I won't tell you different." And Wren nodded and went on with the dough, and the kitchen held the two of them, and the enormous quiet thing that had just happened in it, and let it be. After that the words came the way Mabel had promised they would, not in a flood, but a few at a time, and only ever to Mabel, and only ever in the kitchen, where the bread was, and the woman who did not startle at the sound of her. A question about whether the birds got cold in the night, a flat, low opinion that turnips were the worst of all the vegetables the Lord had troubled to make. Each one offered careful, like a creature setting one foot out of cover to learn whether the world would grab at it, and each one received by Mabel exactly as she received the weather, without fuss, as the plain ordinary speech of a plain ordinary child. Mabel told Jessie none of it. The words were Wren's to spend where she chose, and she had not yet chosen her father, and Mabel would no more have rushed that than she would have stood in the yard and ordered up the spring. Mrs. Cordelia Vane arrived from Omaha the following week, in black silk and certainty, and she did not like one thing she found. She was Maggie's mother, and she had come, she announced, to do what her broken son-in-law plainly could not, to see her granddaughter taken somewhere she could be properly managed. A home for afflicted children. She had it all arranged. A doctor coming Friday to sign the papers, for the child was clearly simple, anyone could see it, mute and wild and 3 years untaught, and no fit company for her was this enormous hired cook the size of a door frame into the bargain. She said the cruelest of it within the child's hearing, the way such people do, certain a silent child cannot understand. Wren understood every word. Mabel saw her understand it, and Mabel, who had spent 3 weeks asking the child for nothing, asked Jessie Pryor that night for the only thing that mattered. She put the drawing on the table in front of him, the ice, the bank, the 4 words, and she watched a man's face come apart. "She thinks she killed Maggie," Mabel said, low and steady. "She's thought it 3 years. She stopped talking to punish herself for it, and you, gently, but she said it, you've let her carry it alone, because you couldn't bear to say your wife's name. That child has been serving a sentence for your grief, Jessie, and there is a woman coming Friday to lock the door on it for good." Jessie Pryor put his face in his hands. "I couldn't," he said, wrecked. "Every time I looked at her I saw Maggie go through the ice, and I couldn't." "I know it," Mabel said. "I do know it. But Friday's coming, and that baby needs to hear the truth in her father's voice before a stranger takes her off to a place that'll prove the lie." And for the first time Jessie Pryor said his dead wife's name out loud, and wept and began, too late and just in time, to thaw. Friday came, and with it Dr. Hatch and his papers, and Mrs. Vane in her black silk, and the minister she'd brought along for a witness, and 2 neighbor men to help with the trunk, and, if it came to it, the child. They were in the front room. They were reaching for her, and Wren Pryor, 8 years old and silent, 3 years, looked at the door they meant to carry her through, and at the one woman in the world who had ever sat in her, quiet without flinching, and the dam broke. "Don't!" It tore out of her, raw and high and unused. The whole room went to stone. "Don't send me away. I'll be good. I went on the ice. It was me. Mama went out because of me, and she died, and it's my fault. It's my fault. Don't make me go." 3 years of it came out of that child in one shaking flood, and Dr. Hatch's papers hung forgotten in his hand, because no one in that room had ever heard a feeble-minded child speak. And this was no feeble-minded child. This was a little girl who had been carrying a grown woman's grief in total silence since she was 5 years old. And Jessie Pryor went down on his knees on the floorboards in front of his daughter, and he said it, the thing 3 years too late and just in time. No, he took her by both shoulders. "No, Wren, listen to me now, because I should have said it the day it happened, and I have hated myself every day I didn't. You did not kill your mother. You were a baby on the ice, and she was your mama, and there is not a mother on God's earth who wouldn't have run out after her child. She'd have done it 1,000 times over and counted it cheap. She didn't die because of you. She died loving you, which is the opposite thing. And I let you believe a lie for 3 years because I was too broken to say her name. That's mine to carry, not yours. It was never yours." And Wren Pryor put her face in her father's neck and cried like the child she had not been allowed to be in 3 years, and said "Papa" into his collar, and the held breath house let out a breath it had held since the ice misses. Cordelia Vane stood in the wreckage of her certainty, with her papers and her doctor and her black silk, and there was nothing left of her case at all, because the whole room had just watched a simple child reason, and grieve and love, and speak with more sense than the grown woman who'd come to cage her. Dr. Hatch put his papers away and said quietly that he saw no afflicted child here and would sign nothing, and that Mrs. Vane had wasted his Friday. The minister looked at the grandmother with a new and cooler eye, and Cordelia Vane, who had perhaps started years ago in her own grief for her own lost daughter, and let it curdle all the way to this, found the room turned entirely against her, and gathered her silk and her doctor and went back to Omaha, defeated, and did not try it again. Then Jesse Pryor stood up with his daughter on his hip, a thing he had not done in 3 years, and he turned to Mabel Ames in front of the doctor and the minister and the two neighbor men who would carry the story back to every porch in Cedar Bluff, and he said it plainly, a man who had just rediscovered his own voice along with his daughter's. "This woman walked into a silent house and gave me back my child. I'll not have her spoken of in this town the way it speaks of her, and I'll not have her leave it either." He looked at her over Wren's dark head. "Stay, Mabel, marry me. You're the only thing that's made a sound in this house in 3 years worth hearing." And Wren, with her new-found voice, said "stay" into her father's shoulder, which settled the matter past any man's speech. Mabel Ames had spent a year of her life unable to make a sound, and a lifetime being told that a woman her size took up too much room in the world, be wanted. She knew the worth of both those things now, the silence and the room. "I'll stay," she said. "I know what it is to lose your words, and I know they come back when somebody's willing to wait in the quiet with you long enough to be trusted." She looked at the child. "I've got nothing but time for that, Wren. As much quiet as you ever need. The words'll keep coming on their own." They came and kept coming, all that winter and the springs after. Wren Pryor grew into a girl who could hardly be hushed, the way the long silent often do once they trust the world to listen, and she drew her mother's face on good paper now, in daylight, and hung it in the front room where everyone could see, because Mabel had taught her that the dead are kept by being spoken of and not by being wiped away. The held breath house breathes. There is bread in it and noise in it, and a man who says his first wife's name without flinching and tells his daughter true stories about her. Jesse and Mabel married before the snow. Mabel Pryor had been measured her whole life and found by small, frightened people to be too much. It turned out the world had been measuring the wrong thing entirely. What that house had needed was not less of her, but more patience than any ordinary woman had, more quiet, more room, a heart big enough to sit 3 weeks in a child's silence without once demanding it end. She had exactly that much, and not an ounce to spare, and she stopped that winter in Nebraska, apologizing to anyone for the size of a soul that had turned out to be precisely large enough for the job. 24 years on, in the spring of 1909, Wren Pryor, grown and a schoolteacher now of all the things, a woman who had made her whole living out of helping children find their words, brought her own little ones home to the farm for Sunday dinner. The kitchen was loud the way it had been loud for 20-odd years, and on the wall of the front room hung 2 pictures side by side in matching frames, a young woman drawn in a careful child's hand, and beside her a broad gray smiling woman drawn in the same hand, grown sure, the mother who went through the ice and the mother who walked through the door, kept together where the whole noisy family could see them, neither one ever wiped away again.